Hey, what it do? YouTube, it's your boy Tony Vogue, the reactor with the long term memory. I think that was it. I swear we ain't short butts in here, or are we? You'll never know, play it. You'll never know. What we got for you today is the Uncomprehensible, Unexplainable Triangle Part 3A for this channel.
And welcome to Part 3 of the Incomprehensible.
See, this is actually just Part 3, but
this is the third.
I want to make it bite size for y'all because I can't watch
recommend watching those before
more than 15-minute videos, man. That TikTok got my brain rot.
And we still have plenty left to cover, so let's get straight into Part 3 of the Unexplainable / Incomprehensible Iceberg. God, that was a good take. Delving below the waves. The WOW signal. The WOW signal was a radio signal detected on August 15th, 1977 by the Ohio State University's Big Ear Radio Telescope. The telescope detected a very odd anomaly that was circled and the word WOW was written next to it, and which you are looking at right now that led to the anomaly's name. The signal, which some say is a cleverly encoded message, is actually a variation of a signal's intensity over time, with the WOW signal reaching at its peak in intensity between 30 and 31, which is 30 times the standard detection from background noise the radio telescope was used to picking up. You can see now why people got very excited about this noise. Its space is equivalent of the bloop sound heard in the ocean.
Alright, well this brings me to an interesting point. Y'all should subscribe, follow, comment, and maybe we could beat this
but what could it mean, or
business,
what is
you
it
know,
exactly?
like YouTube Plus.
It's been extremely hard to replicate for many reasons. The main one being we know roughly what area the signal was heard from, but not exactly, as the Big Ear operated off of two different devices, each receiving a deep beam from slightly different directions. And only on one of the devices, the WOW signal was detected, and the way it was detected intermingled the data, so we have two different areas in which the signal may have come from. So doubling up on searching the area and attempting to try and find where the signal is has made the process take a bit longer. With all this attention though, they really started honing in on what were in these areas, finding multiple stars and even a few sun-like stars. This of course adds to the likelihood of possible extraterrestrial connection to these areas, but so far no techno-signature candidates have been observed in this area. Without me researching, I wouldn't know what that means, but it basically means the radio detection has not been replicated pointed at the same spot, or been observable since. This has led many to believe both that the signal was from a far-off extraterrestrial species emitting their own radio waves from some form of vessel, possibly a lighthouse
comment below if you think it was an
fluke, or a hydrogen cloud
extraterrestrial species
causing a frequency to be picked up on Earth. There are many different possible explanations, but none that any governing scientific body have been willing to put forward and back, or that we have an explanation for, really. But if you happen to have tweeted, by the way, even though it's dying horribly, you can still follow me on Twitter at Gordon Sanafa. Can't get the at Gurdon. A tweet that has the hashtag chasing UFOs in 2012. The Arecibo Observatory leaked a digital stream towards the area that consisted of about 10,000 tweets, as well as videos from celebrities and a repeating header to help any would-be intelligent species know that the message was intentional. So who knows? Maybe there's another intelligent life form out there that's just reading some of our tweets.
Hell yeah.
Mystery eruptions. I covered this a little in my last video on the topics of vampires, oddly enough. Please go watch that video. I put a lot of effort into it and I really like the subject matter, and I hope you do if you like this video. But there are eruptions on this earth that we aren't sure when they happened, or to what degree they happened, but we know that they had an impact on us as people. The more recent major example was one that happened somewhere between 1808 or 1809. A few years after, in 1816 and years around then, the global temperature was oddly low on Earth, with 1816 having the lowest recorded summer temperatures ever between 1766 and 2000.
That's serious.
It caused some real issues, especially with food. This was first believed to have been the cause of the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies, and very much could have been the cause of it all. But new research into the matter has shown that there were very high sulfate spikes, as well as tree ring data that shows that the eruptions may have taken place earlier than expected, possibly as early as 1808. Another theory is that there was a large amount of these mystery eruptions that took place all over the world, in areas we had no access to or were ever recorded, that might have lowered the global temperature by quite a bit, leading to possibly a little ice age. Some people also believe that the large amount of eruptions might have displaced and shaken up the crust of the Earth so much as to cause and led to the eruption of Tambora in 1815, which led to the year without a summer. This, all while many other volcanoes and eruptions have and had been recorded around the time, but none quite enough to affect the world in the way that it did, as well as in the right areas. Some have speculated that these mystery eruptions took place somewhere in Antarctica, as well as someplace in between Indonesia and Tonga, but no one really has the ability or confirmation as to give a definitive answer, and there may never be. Infinity. Infinity is something endless, or the opposite of nothing, everything but more. You know, it's really hard to describe infinity. You try. And that's kind of why it's on this list, because humans have an extremely hard time understanding what in math are called large numbers. Because while humans are pretty good at counting and doing math, we're not very good at comprehending very large numbers. I can count to 100. I can even probably count to 1,000 or 10,000 give it enough time. But do I really understand how many 10,000 of any given thing is? If I give you $1,000 in ones, it might be a whole bunch of paper to deal with. But if I give you $1,000 in pennies, the amount of pennies might be more than you or I would ever see in our combined lives. And that's where large numbers start to trip up humans. We've had many centuries, if not millennia, of living in small areas and villages with maybe a couple hundred to 1,000 people. Or more recently, in cities with millions of people. But this is kind of new to humanity, though, as a whole.
I mean, yeah, megacities are a brand new thing.
But, you know, it's called Dunbar's number, which is the cognitive limit on the number of people that one can maintain social relationships with. And most people, including you and I, can only keep up with about 150 people before we start having a hard time maintaining or keeping people straight in our heads.
Dunbar's number.
That's only 150. And this part of the iceberg isn't called Dunbar's number, it's called infinity. And while yes, 10,872,003 is a large number, technically we can determine this number exactly and correlate it to something in the real world. The amount of sand in an hourglass or pennies, right? But a number so big that the concept of it is something nobody can ever truly grasp is something special. And yet, there are multiple types of infinities and sizes of infinities even. I want to remind you again, I am not a mathematician. And maybe that's why these math concepts really mess with my head. But they're all wild to me and go simultaneously all the way up and all the way down.
I mean, I don't understand math concepts either. That's why I grabbed my bong since this guy started talking.
A little weird, but it's true. You could find infinite smaller numbers between any two whole numbers all the way to its only smaller infinity. Let me give you an example. If you had a 6-inch ruler and you wanted to add
cheers, man, this motherfucker talking about multiple infinities right here.
To that one, you would never ever hit 12 inches. That's what's called an infinite progression. That's just on the smaller side as well. Somehow people out there have found out that while there are technically infinite numbers, not all infinities are made equal. If you have an infinity made of integers or real numbers, you technically would hit the end at some point. While if you had a form of infinity without integers and assigned integers to them instead, the second form of infinity is larger. Stuff like this is way too big brain for me, so if you want, you can watch this video on the infinite hotel paradox, where much smarter people and better at 3D modeling than I am made a helpful informational video to show just how wild infinity is. But luckily, the section of the video isn't infinite, so we can just move on.
Yeah, let's just move on.
Cold fusion, the ability to get more energy out of a nuclear exchange at room temperature.
Yeah, cold fusion would be fire. Imagine cold fusion cell phones
without a nuclear explosion. While this might not sound that crazy on the surface, it only really makes sense on the surface of the sun, that is. The sun has this ability, but it's also able to do this by being about 10 million degrees hotter, and with 100 times the pressure than the deepest points on Earth has to offer. The concept of cold fusion and the ability to compress atoms together to create high amounts of energy has been a decade away, for many decades now. We sadly haven't had much success, or even really breakthroughs in this technology.
They've been saying that since the 70s.
Most of the scientific community isn't even sure that it's a real thing. And that's why I'm here to talk about it. A couple of scientists named Pons and Fleischmann made the original experiment, which was a beaker of heavy water, where each oxygen molecule was bound to 2 deuterium atoms, rather than 2 simple hydrogen atoms. They put a rod of palladium metal into it, and hooked the other end to one side of a battery, while the other terminal was linked to a coil of platinum wrapped around the inner wall of the beaker itself. With this original experiment, Pons and Fleischmann said that in doing this, the experiment produced an amount of heat that shouldn't be possible with the original energy of the battery itself. But the energy had to come from somewhere. The only explanation they could come up with was that the deuterium atoms were fusing and creating energy. There was a major problem though. As soon as these experiments were brought to the public, Government agencies frantically got teams together as quickly as they could and attempted to replicate these results, as this would essentially mean creating more energy than spent in terms of nuclear, and could theoretically mean infinite renewable energy. But when multiple agencies attempted to recreate these experiments, they didn't get anything nearly as substantial and wrote off cold fusion as a hoax. They discredited Pons and Fleischmann to the point of calling cold fusion a myth. Everybody, but oddly, the United States Navy Office of Naval Research. They kept funding research going into cold fusion for years, but did it ever amount to anything? And that's where things get weird. Most organizations concluded that no heat or energy, or very sparingly excess flashes of heat, would arise, while others like Melvin Miles went from no heat or excess energy to reporting 30 to 50% more energy than was put in. What did Miles get for this, though? He was reprimanded, and the budget for research on cold fusion was cancelled after he had refined the formula for years. Miles became unemployable after reporting this information. His hundreds of peer-reviewed papers ended up meaning nothing, and Miles ended his career as a clerk in a storeroom, taking boxes off of shelves. This is a cautionary tale that only begets more caution. You see,
mobile games are going big.
This is another opportunity for me to remind y'all.
Julian Schwinger was a Nobel Prize-winning theoretical physicist. Schwinger, who sadly passed away from pancreatic cancer in 1994, spent his final years on Earth studying cold fusion.
The man said 1994. We're going to give it to him.
And scientists that helped nail down the theory of quantum electrodynamics, which, until many years of research by a committed team, was considered an anomaly itself, and what drove Schwinger to delve into the topic in the first place. It was an anomaly, but one that had at least been observed and could be speculated about. But in the end, he ended up spending his last years on a subject that sadly amounted to nothing more than disdain from the scientific community as a whole, with many editors and peers refusing to publish or edit any of his last 8 theory papers. Such an anomaly as cold fusion, whether a fluke or a groundbreaking discovery and breakthrough, should be studied and looked into. And in 2004, there was hope. The Department of Energy in the United States released a study that admitted that maybe there was something to cold fusion after all, long after many of its pioneers had been shamed and even passed away. You see, those government agencies I mentioned before had reached out to leading scientific bodies which did their research, and the top 3 were MIT, Caltech, and the United Kingdom's Holwell Laboratory. All 3 at the time reported that Pons and Fleischmann's report had no scientific basis. That is, until years later, the chief science writer of MIT at the time reviewed the paper and noticed that they had made an amendment to the paper 3 days before the final report, stating that there had been excess energy and heat. The chief science writer brought up these discrepancies, lodged a formal complaint, and resigned in protest. The damage had already been done, though. Those reports, all those years earlier, by all 3 agencies, had been presented to Congress and funding had been pulled. But now, with the Department of Energy admitting that maybe there is something to cold fusion, there's hope that maybe this mystery can finally be solved. In the years since the Department of Energy's admission that maybe there's something to cold fusion after all, reliable, incontestable evidence of nuclear reactions has been reported and shown that there's a future. The Navy has begun funding research into cold fusion again and backing it, but there's a distinct lack of the word fusion in their funding, just low-energy nuclear reactions, which is a start, but there's still a long way to go until we can finally understand why this happens.
I mean, nuclear fusion is kind of the holy grail.
If there are ways to use cold fusion to our advantage, or if it's just scraping the surface of nuclear reactions. Until then, we just have to keep our minds open to any theories out there. The black stain.
What is the black stain?
Is a mysterious black substance that oozes from the roads in Caracas, Venezuela. Yeah, I read that right. I guess we're getting pretty deep in the iceberg, huh? Anyways, the black stain, or as it's called in Venezuela, La Mancha Negra, is an odd, quote, blob of thick black sludge with the consistency of chewing gum, end quote. First noticed by ground crews that had been sent in to repair the pothole-ridden area. The crews showed up and began the basic repair task of fixing up the roads, when they noticed this odd goo oozing out from the road in an area of only roughly 50 yards. They paid it no mind, as their job was to fix the potholes and repair the roads, not investigate, you know, black mystery fluid that no one has ever really experienced or come in contact with. So they did their job and went on their way. 5 years later, though, the black stain now covered 8 miles of the same road and has caused many accidents and even deaths. The goo is so far only found on a busy road that is the main thoroughfare between the capital city of Venezuela and its main international airport, allowing much traffic to cross and interact with the mystery substance. Locals have described driving on the black stain like, quote, driving in a Grand Prix. You've got to be careful or you'll die. Now, this wouldn't be that wild of an unexplained/unknown occurrence if not for the absurd amount of deaths that have been reportedly caused by the black stain. In the first 5 years after it appeared, La Mancha Negra had managed to kill 1,800 people on the 8-mile stretch where it occupies. For comparison, the I-5 in California, which is considered the deadliest road in America, in the 5-year period between 2015 and 2019, only killed 584 people, roughly along the same length of highway.
There's some
But
crazy
what is
shit
the
going
black
on
stain?
there.
That's not only why it's on this iceberg list, but so low. And the answer is still unknown to this day.
What?
It sounds straight out of a horror film. Many people say that they will clean the black stain away one day and it'll be back the next. Some say that the black stain is nothing more than a buildup of oil and fluids from old and badly maintained cars that seemingly leaks onto the road and causes buildup with dust. But as locals and people around the world are quick to point out, many other places on Earth have poorly maintained cars and oil slicks, and no other place has reported this black stain. On top of that, this mysterious goo comes and goes as it pleases. One day seeping out from the asphalt and causing mayhem, and the next is nowhere to be seen. It also doesn't seem to follow conventional means of flowing and filling lower gaps on flat open terrain, and instead appears in tunnels and on uphill slopes. There are plenty of conspiracy theories and ways that people have tried to explain away the black stain, but none so far have come close to a definitive answer. The Venezuelan government has paid millions of dollars to research and attempt to figure out what the black stain was and still doesn't know, as the black stain has seemingly disappeared and isn't a problem to the Venezuelan government or people these days. So will we ever know what this botched black stain is? Who knows?
That's
Maybe.
wild,
But until
honestly.
then, it's time to dive one layer
Black
deeper into the
stain.
bottom of this ice.
I'm telling y'all, it's venom. If y'all believe otherwise, drop a comment below. This has been part 3C of our reaction to Garden, GRDN's Incomprehensible Triangle. Hope you enjoyed.